Is anybody else starting to see the trend, by the way, that I'm seeing? Buffalo Bills, they have allowed Josh Allen to be sacked fewer than any other quarterback in pro football this year. Kansas City Chiefs interior offensive line, probably the best in the game. Who's the best team in the NFC? Detroit. What do they have? The best offensive line in the game. Green Bay this year has been running the hell out of the ball. They got a good runner, but they got a really solid offensive line. Look at Philadelphia in the second half of games.
193 rushing yards per game they're averaging.
Yeah, and what did they do? They went and they got that just absolute behemoth, Mekhi Becton, and they said, yeah, you're a bust as a tackle, but you'd be an overwhelming right guard. They're sticking him at right guard. You got Lane Johnson, you got Mailata, you got that guy. I mean, you got you some monsters up front, and their whole line in the second half of games is taking over. That Commanders defensive front just got wasted a couple weeks ago on that. Was it a Thursday nighter?
Rams have a good front, and the Eagles ran right through them.
Saquon ran in the second half. It was just like no contest. And I bet the Eagles the other day against the Rams, and I knew that they were going to wear them down at the end. Sure enough, they wore them down at the end. So I'm just kind of looking, is that the undoing of the Shanahan Lynch regime? Is their attitude and approach to building the offensive line? Because I just looked at pass block win rate. Trent Williams is a top 20 tackle. I think he's number 2 overall, believe it or not, in pass block win rate. No other 49er offensive lineman is in the top 20. They're not good at Banks has been disappointing. I thought if this was the most disappointing film that I've seen in Banks' career. Carl Brooks pushed him around, beat him with power, beat him with quickness. I thought Banks had a really rough day in Green Bay. Brendel is gives me dirty looks in the locker room because I keep talking so much trash about how he's playing because he's playing terribly.
Dude, he's the lowest graded center in the NFL. Come on.
Right. Yeah, and I look over there and he's like, he's giving me the evil eye, and it's like, dude, play better, and we'll say you played better. Pooney's been good at right guard, but he's a rookie, and McKivitz at times has had some moments, but he's also had bad moments. Is the offensive line now have to be the focus of the offseason? And is that a mistake that the Niners kind of view the offensive line as like, hey, well, they kind of view it the way they always viewed it in the 80s. Like, we'll just get anybody, and our great O-line coach, then McKittrick, now Chris Forster, will put it all together. McKittrick had success doing it. Forster, not so much.
Yeah, and you think about what the Niners even said themselves. They've said this as an organization. Chris Forster talked about it a couple of months ago. We prioritize as a team skill position players who score touchdowns as compared to building up the offensive line. And right now, Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch's philosophy along the offensive line reminds me of like the newspaper business or the coal industry, the iron industry. Well, we've always done it this way, so why change? Well, those businesses and in that line of business, they never adapted, they never evolved, and then they got passed by. And I don't think that the Niners are so far off as an organization to the point where they're not going to be a contender in 2025. I think Bill Belichick made a really good point on the Pat McAfee show a couple of weeks ago when he said, when you lose a bunch of close games, the gap for your organization feels like an ocean because those losses are so ugly, especially when the Niners lost 3 divisional games that they should have won, that they controlled when they had leads with under 2 minutes to go. And so this Niners team, the gap is not an ocean. I think they need to retool as compared to rebuilding. But my biggest thing with this team right now, and the one thing that's holding them back, and the one thing I think that could continue to hold them back in the NFC in particular, is ignoring the offensive line. You mentioned it. Detroit kicks ass and they take names up front. Best offensive line in football. They're the number 1 seed in the NFC. The Philadelphia Eagles are running for nearly 200 yards per game, 5.5 yards per carry. They wear teams down throughout the course of a 60-minute ball game, and they kick the other team's ass up front. I think Green Bay might be the 3rd best team in the NFC right now. They always prioritize the offensive line. So these are the teams that the Niners are going to be directly competing against in the NFC for the foreseeable future. And you are not going to win a title. I've been saying this for 3 years. if you don't prioritize the offensive line. Trent Williams is a great player. Aaron Banks has had a surprisingly disappointing year. In a contract year, he's been bad. You are looking at 3/5 of your offensive line that simply can't cut it. And think about it. When you're in the playoffs, when you're playing in the Super Bowl, the teams who you are playing against usually have good offensive lines and they have good defensive lines. I'm a firm believer that you build your teams in the trenches. The Niners have invested in the defensive line. They've at least tried. Their moves haven't worked out. I know what you mentioned this week about Javon Hargrave. That signing's been a disaster, but they've ignored the offensive line. Jake Brendel has been a journeyman for a reason. Colton McKivitz has been a swing tackle and a backup for a reason. Aaron Banks, I'd say let him go. You have to find a new left guard. You have Dominic Pooney and Trent Williams. Those are two really good players. And even though Trent Williams is getting older, when he's been on the field this year, he's been productive. But I think the one thing that the Niners need to do this offseason, upgrade at center, upgrade at left guard, and get a real right tackle. And you think about what's happened the last 3 years. The NFC Championship game was decided when Aaron Donald broke through the Niners offensive line, pressured Jimmy Garoppolo. He had to throw it away, intended for JaMychal Hasty, picked off, game over in the NFC Championship game. In 2022, I know Hassan Reddick was on Tyler Kroft, but the Eagles defensive line dominated the Niners offensive line in that football game. What happened in the Super Bowl back in February? The Chiefs defensive line annihilated the Niners offensive line. And so this is costing you with your scheme now because you're not run blocking as well. It's costing you in pass protection. We saw how much the Niners missed the mobility of Brock Purdy because Brandon Allen is a statue in the pocket. He can't create out of structure. And it's costing you in the biggest of football games. And so I think priority number one for the Niners this offseason is to change their philosophy of how they emphasize the offensive line because it's killing them right now.
It's hard to scout offensive linemen. But there are guys out there. One of the tackles I love in this draft is a guy named Anthony Belton from Maryland. There's a Montana State guard named Marcus Weir, who's just a monster, destroyer. And there'll be more that I will keep my eye on between now and obviously the draft process. But they have to get serious about building the offensive line. Look at the Steelers. They drafted Troy Fatanu. They drafted Zach Frazier, and they turned around and drafted Mason McCormick. In my opinion, they got the best guard, tackle, and center in this draft. And despite the fact that they've had to use two different quarterbacks, they're a playoff team and looking really good. And suddenly, and the 49ers, it's like this stopgap approach to the offensive line. Get some big physical destroyers. Start blowing people off the ball. The Niners look like the inside run. Like Kansas City looks like they could live the entire game with the just running between the guards. The Niners look like they could never get a yard if they had to run between the guards. And they almost, Shanahan kind of coaches it that way. They get to 4th and 1.5. Unless they go QB sneak, they don't have a way to hand the ball to a back and get 2 yards at the point of attack between the tackles and definitely between the guards. So, I mean, they got to do better on that offensive line. You could make the argument that football starts with the offensive line, and and every one of the teams standing between you and your desired goal of winning the Super Bowl are really good on the offensive line. So it's like you better get there.